Hey guys, Chapter 6, A New Nation. The pursuit of equality. So, central to Republican ideology was civic virtue. Democracy depended on unselfish commitment of each citizen to public good. So, it was your job to create a better America. Who could better cultivate virtue than the mothers? Because every family, almost every family at one time, had a mother. So, this idea of Republican motherhood is going to elevate women to prestigious role as social keepers of the nation's conscience. Educational opportunities for women expanded so wives and mothers could better cultivate virtue, and Republican women now bore the responsibility for survival of the nation. Now, the Constitutional Congress in 76 called on colonies to draft new state constitutions. They asked the colonies to bring themselves in as new states. Sovereignty would rest with the authority of the people. Connecticut and Rhode Island merely retouched their colonial charters. They didn't really add much to it. Others are going to just go to town writing their own new constitution. Massachusetts is going to call for a special convention to draft its constitution. Once adopted, it could now only be changed by another constitutional convention. It remains the longest lived state constitution in the world. Here you can see a famous painting I referenced a few chapters ago by John Trumbull. And this is the painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And you have Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and John Adams. Economic changes. States are going to seize control of former land that was held by the crown. Land was cheap and easily available. Supply and demand, the more you have of something, the cheaper it is. And in America, the economic democracy preceded political democracy because what's the bottom line? Money. Drawbacks of economic independence. Most British commerce was reserved for loyal parts of the empire. We weren't one of them. And American ships were now barred from British and the British West Indies. That means no sugar. Fisheries are going to be disrupted, but Americans could freely trade with foreign nations. Now, the Second Continental Congress was little more than just a little quick conference between the ambassadors. It had no constitutional authority, and the 13 states did say they were sovereign. They could each coin their own money, they could each raise armies and navies, and they each erected tariff barriers. Now, the Articles of Confederation were adopted in 1777, but they were not ratified by the states until 1781. Now, the chief point of contention was Western lands. 6 states had no holdings behind or beyond the Allegheny Mountains. So if all of the states were going to just continue going, 6 of them were landlocked and they couldn't move any further. 7 of them, New York and Virginia, had massive amounts of acreage. And there's a map coming up. The land-rich states could use the Trans-Allegheny Tracts to pay off the debt. But what about the debt of the little states that could not? So unanimous approval of the articles by all 13 states was required. Maryland is going to hold out until March of 1781 until they could get an agreement by New York to give up its land. So if you look over here, you can see all of this land is going to be claimed by Maryland, by Virginia, by Connecticut. But some of the states didn't have land that went past. Congress pledged to dispose of these vast areas for the common benefit, and they promised to carve out a number of Republican states. Pledge redeemed in Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which is coming up in a few slides. This is going to help encourage union. It provided, the Articles of Confederation, provided for loose confederation or firm legal friendship. 13 independent states linked together to deal with common problems. The biggest problem was foreign affairs. Congress was the chief agency. They had no executive branch, so no president. And judicial issues almost left exclusively to the states. Each state had one single vote. All important bills required 9. Any amendments was unanimous. You could not amend the articles unless all 13 states agreed. And usually one state is going to hold out. Congress was weak, but it was designed to be weak so that they wouldn't be subjected to what Congress had done, Parliament had done, Now, there were 2 major weaknesses, and they both deal with the bottom line. What's the bottom line? Money. Congress had no power to regulate commerce, and they could not enforce tax. They couldn't tax. They could advise, they could advocate, they can appeal. They could not force. They could not control. Congress had paper money, but it was less effective. But it did have some perks. Articles were a significant step toward the Constitution we're eventually going to write. And they kept alive the ideal of union, and the old association to the current Constitution could not have been possible without the Articles. Probably the biggest success of the Articles of Confederation lay with the Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance of 1785. The Old Northwest is the area that the British and the French were fighting over in the Ohio River Valley, pictured there in green. In 1785, the map here shows that there was an orderly process created to sell land in the Old Northwest. The land was surveyed, it was divided equally into townships, into sections, and the 16th of the 36th section had to be sold for schools. So if you look here, that little corner here of Ohio, blown up, is going to be cut into 6 mile squares. Each square is going to be cut into 1 mile squares, and one of them is going to be 640 acres, 160 acres per quarter, or 40 acres per 1/8 of the quarter, or I can't math, but number 16 had to be reserved for schools. So at least we're already understanding that education was a priority. Now, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is going to be significant. This is the governing. So the Land Ordinance divided the land. The Northwest was the government. First temporary tutelage, then permanent equality. First 2 evolutionary stages. So once a territory had reached 60,000 people, then they could be admitted to Congress as a state. The Northwest Ordinance banned slavery, and that is going to be significant coming up. Relations with Britain is going to be troubled. England refused to send a diplomat to America. Rude. Declined to negotiate commercial treaty or repeal the navigation laws that technically were still in effect. They closed the West Indies so we couldn't get the sugar that we love. We tried, with the help of the Allen brothers pictured here, to annex rebellious areas to Canada. Like, you don't want to be here? We don't want you. Go. And they're like, no, I'm going to stick around. They maintained a chain of trading posts on U.S. soil, and they continued the fur trade with the Indians. It's like, we may have lost the war, but you can't get rid of us. Spain was openly hostile to the new republic. They controlled the Mississippi River, and Spain is going to close the Mississippi River to the United States. And this is going to strangle our economy because we traveled, if you look at the map, we traveled all up and down that river. They claimed large areas north of the Gulf of Mexico. They planned with the Indians to keep Americans east of the Appalachians with attacks. And it was pretty bad. France, America's friend, is going to cool off now that Britain was humbled. So they weren't on our side too much. North African pirates are going to ravage America's Mediterranean commerce, and New Nation was too weak to fight the pirates. So the pirates are going to be significant because the pirates attack unless you pay their bribe or their tribute. And England would pay the tribute every year. They had the money. America is no longer protected by the British crown. So we had to pay the tribute ourselves. We couldn't, and the pirates are going to terrorize us. Here you could see the land disputed by Spain and the influence that the Spanish had. Now, economic problems are going to be abound. System of raising tax money was breaking down. We couldn't collect taxes. Interest on public debt was escalating. States were putting their own duties. Some people were just printing money left and right, depreciating the value of money. And then Shays' Rebellion happened. Look at this. He's like, no, don't drown me. Shays' Rebellion in Western Massachusetts. Impoverished farmer lost land because of the mortgage foreclosures. And it is going to be led by Daniel Shay. Now, he is going to demand that the state issue paper money, lighten the taxes, and suspend property takeover. So stop foreclosing on farmers' land just because we couldn't pay taxes. Hundreds attempted to enforce it. Massachusetts authorities are going to respond to Shays' Rebellion by raising a small army. Skirmishes are going to occur, and 3 Shayites are going to be killed and wounded, and the movement is going to collapse. The reason the movement collapsed is because Daniel Shays contracts dysentery. Dysentery, if you're not familiar with, is an inflammatory disease of the intestines in which you get diarrhea and you poop and poop and poop until you die. You poop to death. It's a very painful way to go. His followers were crushed, but the memory remained. Ooh, that's a Metallica song. Massachusetts passed debtor relief laws. Shay's outburst did cause fear among property class. Civic virtue is insufficient, and they needed stronger central government. No more mobocracy, because who was able to stop Daniel Shay? We didn't have a national army. Nobody could stop him. So conservatives exaggerated the seriousness of the nation's plight. They sought to amend the articles to create more central government. Both friends and critics agreed that it needed strengthening, but then the economy is going to start improving. So the Annapolis Convention of 1786 is going to be called to deal with the commercial disputes, because what's the bottom line? Money. 9 states are going to appoint delegates, only 5 attended. Hamilton is going to get convention to call for a meeting in Philadelphia in 1787, and all they're going to do is revise the articles. We're not going to do anything. We are going to revise them. We're going to change them. We're going to add to them. Each state is going to send a representative, except Rhode Island. 55 delegates from 12 states are going to convene in Philadelphia on May 25th, 1787. They were held in secrecy. They had armed sentinels at the door. The curtains were covering the windows. It was super hot. Everybody was sweaty, but it was done in secret. Jefferson called the people working there demigods. Most were lawyers with experience at Constitution. I mean, if you're going to write a Constitution, you want lawyers there. I mean, come on. Washington is going to be elected the chairman. Franklin is going to serve as an elder statesman, probably because he was the oldest man there. And then James Madison, my favorite president, his contributions are so notable, he's dubbed the father of the Constitution. He literally wrote a large chunk of the Constitution. Hamilton advocated a super powerful central government. Most of the leaders of 1776 were absent, though. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Thomas Paine were in Europe doing Europe things. If you watch the Hamilton film, okay. Samuel Adams and John Hancock were not elected, and probably because they were, dastardly Sons of Liberty anarchists. Patrick Henry was elected, but he refused to attend because he, quote, smelled a rat. He knew something was up. Time had come to fashion a new political system. So these 55 delegates were lawyers, merchants, shippers, land speculators, bank people, nobody from the debtor group. So it was all the elite. Young, because the average was 42, but they did have experience. They wanted to preserve their republic rather than stir up democracy. They hoped to crystallize Okay. Now, they wanted a firm, dignified, and respected government. They believed in republicanism. They wanted a central government to control taxes. They wanted to preserve the union. They wanted to curb democracy, and they were motivated by fear. If we don't do it, the country's going to fall apart. Some delegates decided to scrap the articles completely and say, look, it's not going to work. So if you bake a cake and you forget to put in the cup of sugar and you taste it and you're like, what am I eating? You're not going to put sugar on top to fix it. You have to throw it away and bake a new one, right? You can't just fix that. So despite explicit instructions not to, they are going to scrap it completely and begin from scratch. Now, the Virginia plan, when it comes to representation, the Virginia plan was known as the large state plan, and it said representation in both houses of a bicameral Congress would be based on population. The New Jersey plan said, no, it should be equal. It's not fair. We don't have as many people as you, Virginia. And there was a bitter debate because small states were afraid Virginia is going to allow domination. So the Great Compromise, which I want to say was written by Roger Sherman, I could be wrong, larger states gained representation by population in the House of Reps. Smaller states were appeased by equal representation in the Senate, and the Senate has the majority of the power. They agreed all tax bills, all laws that demand or that go through money must originate in the House, not in the Senate. Compromise did break the deadlock. So it was like, whew, we almost just went straight home. Okay. Now, the president had broad authority to make appointments to domestic offices, including judgeships. He had the power to veto legislation, not absolute power to wage war, and Congress retained the crucial right to declare war. So even though the president was in charge, he could not declare war. He had to ask Congress for that permission. So elect a president indirectly by electoral college. A state share of electors were based on the total of its senators and representatives. And then slavery in the Constitution. The North didn't want slaves to count. The South did because like 60% of the population in the South were slaves. So the Three-Fifths Compromise was created in which for every 5 slaves, it would count as 3 people with regards to representation. The slave trade could continue to 1807, which was 20 years. Now, agreement was pretty there. Economically, they demanded sound money. Politically, they wanted a strong government with 3 branches. They rejected manhood suffrage. So they're like, hey, let's not get hasty. We don't want all the men to vote. And they erected safeguards. So federal judges were appointed for life to prevent them from, being bribed. President had to be elected indirectly. Senators were chosen indirectly. That changes with the 17th Amendment. And in the House of Reps, qualified citizens were able to choose their officials by direct vote. Farmers are going to see the nationwide acceptance of the Constitution would be, I said farmers, I meant framers, difficult. Unanimous ratification by all 13 states was required for the Articles. And remember, Rhode Island was going to veto it. So delegates stipulated that when 9 states had approved the Constitution, then it would be supreme. So they knew that if they had it unanimous like the Articles, it had no hope of passing because Rhode Island. But if you have 9, you don't need Rhode Island. Now, the people are going to be divided into 2 groups, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were anti-Constitution. The Federalists were pro. Famous Anti-Federalists included Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee. They wanted the states to have more power. These were more the farmers, the plantation owners, the debtors. The Federalists, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, were those who lived on the seaboard. They were wealthy, they were educated, they knew better. Anti-Federalists said that we needed some kind of protection against the powerful Constitution. So special elections are going to be held for the ratifying conventions. Candidates were reelected based on whether they were for or against the Constitution. 4 states quickly accepted the Constitution. Pennsylvania was the first large state to ratify. Massachusetts presented challenges, including the demand for a Bill of Rights. Once they were promised a Bill of Rights, Massachusetts ratified it. Very close margin. 3 more states signed. New Hampshire was the last. All but Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island had taken shelter under this. So the document was officially signed on June 21st, 1788. But there were 4 states that still refused. And here you can see the population and when they voted. Look, Delaware, New Jersey, Georgia was unanimous. So Virginia, let's talk about the 4 laggard states. They had the fiercest anti-federalist opposition. They claimed that it was a death warrant. Now, what's weird is George Washington, James Madison, and John Marshall, they were all Virginians. James Madison. They offered in very influential support, and the state convention is finally going to ratify it 89 to 79. Hamilton is going to join John Jay and James Madison in a series of Federalist newspaper articles from New York called the Federalist Papers. They were the most penetrating commentary ever written on the Constitution. The most famous one is Madison's Federalist number 10, which we're going to look at, refuted that it was impossible to extend a Republican form of government over a large territory. So all the people said, there's no way a large government can be over a large country. And he's like, bet. New York finally yielded, ratifying, I can't read the count, let's see, 30 to 27. So it was pretty close. North Carolina is going to adjourn without even taking a vote. Rhode Island didn't even summon a convention, and they rejected the Constitution. 2 most ruggedly individualist centers remained true to form. No lives were lost, but there were riots that broke out, lots of behind-the-scenes pressure. But the last 4 states ratified not because they wanted to, but they had to. They could not safely exist by themselves outside the new nation. So a minority triumphed twice. First, a militant minority of radicals with a revolution, and then with replacing the Articles of Confederation. A majority had not spoken. Only 1/4 of adult white males voted for delegations. Now, Washington is going to be unanimously drafted as president by Electoral College, only presidential nominee in American history to ever receive unanimity. Unanimity. There we go. Anemone. Only one who did not in some way angle for the office, commanded by strength and character. So what's going to happen is every elector votes for two men. Every single elector voted for Washington and somebody else. Now, the way the Constitution was written, whoever came in first place became president, second place became the vice. So he won. John Adams was second place, or what I like to call the first loser. He became the vice president, took office on April 30th, 1789. He created a cabinet and is going to set the example for that. The Constitution didn't mention a cabinet, but he did and set the president. At first, only 3 department heads served under the president: the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of Treasury, Hamilton, and the Secretary of War, Henry Knox. The original Constitution did not guarantee individual rights, such as freedom of religion or right to trial by jury. Some states ratified the Constitution knowing that one day it's going to be added. Crafting Bill of Rights topped the list of imperatives. So by constitutional convention that was requested by 2/3 of the states, or a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, Madison determined to draft these amendments himself. John Madison is then going to write 12 and guide them through Congress. 10 of these 12 are going to be ratified. Freedom of religion, speech, and press, the right to bear arms, right to trial by jury, right to assemble and petition, right to, and it also prohibited cruel and unusual punishment and illegal searches and seizures. Madison is going to insert the 9th Amendment. If it's not illegal, then you can do it, basically. And then to help the states' writers, he's going to include the 10th Amendment. If it's not in the Constitution, the power goes to the state. Nowhere in the Constitution does it talk about education or how old you have to be to get married or speed limits. Therefore, the states are responsible. Judiciary Act of 1789 was also organized. The Supreme Court with a Chief Justice and 5 associates. Here you could see Chief Justice John Jay. Federal district and circuit courts were also created, and it established the office of the Attorney General. John Jay, of course, pictured here, does become the first Chief Justice. Now, Hamilton is going to have a significant role. Okay, my dog was scratching at the door. Hamilton's role in the new government: he worked to correct economic vexations of the Articles of Confederation. He sought to bolster the national credit. So he urged Congress to fund the debt, and he urged Congress to assume debt incurred by the states during the Revolution. But at Parliament, government officials would pay its debt at face value, not at like 2.5 cents per dollar. And the accumulated interest for a sum of $54 million. People thought this was impossible. Bonds depreciated, but Congress is going to pass it in 1790. Hamilton urged Congress to assume the state's debts totaling $21.5 million. He argued state debts from the Revolution were a national obligation. He believed that it would make the states feel more like a part of the Union. States with heavy debts like Massachusetts were happy, but the southern states were upset because they didn't have debt, because they had slaves, labor that they didn't have to pay. So Virginia opposed it because they had no, they had no debt. So it's like they are going to meet, and Jefferson, Hamilton, and others are going to meet, and they're going to negotiate. So they will approve his assumption on the condition that the South gets the capital. So the capital of America is going to be placed on the Potomac River, technically in the South. This compromise, of course, was made in 1790. Now, the new government was dangerously overloaded. The debt was $75 million. Hamilton, the father of national debt, wasn't worried. He believed that the national debt was a blessing because the creditors would be able to pay it off and feel successful. They raised money through duties. So the first tariff is going to be 8%. The main goal, of course, was to raise revenue, protect infant industries, and he wanted an industrial revolution. Hamilton wanted more manufacturing. So we don't have to buy English goods. We make our own. Congress voted only 2 slight increase in tariffs during Washington's presidency. He also secured an excise tax on alcohol, specifically whiskey. whiskey, new levy of 7 cents a gallon borne by distillers who lived in the backcountry, and whiskey flowed so freely on the frontier that it was used for money. So people would actually trade in whiskey. So there's going to be a whiskey rebellion because the farmers are going to be severely upset that they have to pay the tax. Now, Hamilton is going to lastly propose a Bank of the United States. He took this from the model in England. It proposed powerful private institution where the government was a major stockholder. The Treasury is going to put all of its monies there and pay debts from there. It would stimulate business and it would provide money for the US government. But Jefferson and other anti-federalists vehemently opposed the bank. They insisted there's no mention of the bank in the Constitution. They both said, oh, but it goes to it's the 10th Amendment. If it's not in the Constitution, it goes to the states. And he said, therefore, only the states had the power to charter banks. And this is basically the concept of strict construction. And Hamilton is like, yeah, no, because we have something called the elastic clause, where if the government needs to pass something to help the government, then they can. This is the loose interpretation. And so he used the necessary and proper clause to carry it out, and Congress voted for it. Congress was empowered to regulate trade. Therefore, according to Hamilton, a bank was necessary. Hamilton's financial views prevailed. Washington signed it into law, and the biggest support came from commercial and financial centers in North, because of course they're banks. The strongest opposition was the South. Now, the Bank of the United States was created in 1791, and it was set for a charter for 20 years. It allowed capital of $10 million, or 20% owned by the federal government, and it was located in Philadelphia. Now, the Whiskey Rebellion flared in the southwest Pennsylvania area because of Hamilton's whiskey tax. Big challenge for the new government. So Washington is going to summon militias, and he is going to personally go with thousands of troops on Nelson to put down this rebellion. So by the time he got to Pennsylvania, these whiskey boys had dispersed. And this is going to prove two things. Number one, the government is strong enough to stand a rebellion. And number two, Washington could be quick to respond. So the Constitution worked. Now, Hamilton's schemes encroached sharply on states' rights, though. He organized opposition, began to rise, and the two-party is going to really come front and center. Skip this for now. Okay, so the French Revolution is going to occur, and there were two major parties, Jefferson's Democratic Republicans and Hamilton's Federalists. So in Washington's second term, foreign policy issues are going to escalate. The French Revolution is going to break out in 1789 with the storming of the Bastille, and this is going to destabilize Europe for like 26 years. Few non-American events have left deeper scars, should be an S, on American political life. So in the beginning, it was peaceful. They tried to put constitutional restrictions on King Louis XVI. France is going to declare war on Austria. News later reached America that they proclaimed itself a republic. Americans were enthusiastic because, yes, we want more republics, no more monarchies. And then the king was beheaded in 1793. This is going to begin the reign of terror under Robespierre. Earlier battles had not affected America directly, but once Britain was brought into it, the ripples are going to spread to the New World. So here you could see a picture of the storming of the Bastille. Here you can see Louis XVI beheaded, bleeding into a basket while this guy has his head on a stick. Yep, he's dead. French alliance. The French did have the Franco-American alliance of 1778. Remember, during the American Revolution, they sided with us. Well, this bound us to help France defend the West Indies. The Democratic Republicans said, hey, maybe we should honor this. We signed it. And the Federalists are going to say, with who? We signed it with Louis XVI. He's just beheaded. You know, we don't have to. Washington said, look, we can't afford another war. We're in debt. We assumed the state's debt. We just can't afford it. So Hamilton and Jefferson are going to agree. Washington is going to issue the Neutrality Proclamation. And after that, war between England and France is going to begin. And it is at this time that Jefferson is going to resign as Secretary of State to protest. The Neutrality Proclamation said that we were going to be neutral in the war between England and France. We weren't citizens to be impartial. We're neutral. Don't get involved. So the pro-French Jeffersonians were angry that we weren't doing anything, and the pro-British Federalists were heartened, like, hey, we don't have to do anything. Edmund Gennett, the representative of the French Republic, a diplomat, is going to come to Charleston. He is going to be swept away by the Jeffersonians, and he said neutrality doesn't represent everybody. He embarked on a non-neutral activity that was against the Neutrality Proclamation, so Washington is going to demand that he be removed. And he was. Policy of neutrality is going to be sorely tried by the British. They kept a chain of northern posts on U.S. soil in defiance of our peace treaty. London didn't want to abandon the fur trade that they had. London also wanted to build an Indian buffer to make sure that we wouldn't be attacked. And they sold firearms and alcohol to the Confederacy. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers of 1794, General Anthony Wayne is going to round up the Miamis, routed them. After British refused to shelter them, the Miamis offered to make peace with Wayne. So when the Americans attacked the natives and the British didn't help, they saw who their true friends were. In the Treaty of Grenville, the Miamis surrendered vast tracts of the Old Northwest. In exchange, they received $20,000 and an annual annuity of $9. The right to hunt any land that they gave up. They felt it put limits on the ability of them to decide their fate. The British are going to get 300 American ships. They're going to impress the sailors, and they're going to throw hundreds into dungeons in retaliation. Now, John Jay, the Chief Supreme Court Justice, is going to, under Washington's tutelage, is going to go to London to negotiate a treaty. Jeffersonians hated that they were sending a Federalist and an Anglophile. That means somebody who was siding with the British. Jay's negotiations were sabotaged by Hamilton. So Jay won very few concessions in Jay's treaty. British promised to evacuate the forts, but they didn't. They consented to pay damages for past seizures, but they never said that they were going to stop seizing the ships. They never said they were going to stop supplying weapons to the Indians. Now, his unpopular pact is going to vitalize the Democratic Republican Party against the Federalists. It was seen as a betrayal in the South. Even Washington's popularity was hurt because how is this neutral? Other consequences, fearing an Anglo-American alliance, Spain is going to say, oh, wait, the United States is going to sign a treaty with England. We need to get involved. So we are going to sign a treaty called Pinckney's Treaty. This is going to give us free navigation of the Mississippi for the first time in like 10 years, warehouse rights at New Orleans, my second favorite city, and territory of Western Florida. And you could see that territory up here. Washington decided to retire because he was exhausted. Everything going on as president and everything, he said, you know what? A nice tradition would be 2 years. You don't want somebody to be president forever. So he had Hamilton draft his farewell address, and he delivered it orally, printed in the newspapers. Everybody knows what it says. We're actually going to do an activity on it. He strongly advised America against permanent alliances. He favored temporary alliances. And he basically said, don't get involved, no political parties. Washington's contributions, the federal government was solidly established. It kept the nation out of overseas entanglements. And when he left office, he was showered with brickbats of partisan abuse, in contrast with bouquets that greeted upon his arrival. And then John Adams becomes president. So Adams, with the support of New England, is going to win a narrow margin. So remember when Thomas Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State? He ran for president. He came in second place, or as I like to call, the first loser. Adams was stubborn. He was tactless. He was an aristocrat. He was uppity. He was arrogant. He was educated. So he looked down his nose at everybody. Nobody really liked him. He stepped into Washington's shoes, and they were huge shoes to fill. Hamilton hated him, like totally hated him. Most ominous of all, Adams inherited a violent quarrel with France. So the French were super pissed off at Jay's treaty because they felt, you couldn't honor the Franco-American alliance, but you're going to sign a treaty with England, our enemy. So they condemned it as a step toward an alliance with Britain. French warships in retaliation are going to seize these defenseless American merchant vessels, 300 by 1797, and the Paris regime refused to receive America's newly appointed envoy. So Adams is going to try to reach an agreement. So he is going to send 3 men, including John Marshall, future Chief Justice, and they're going to reach Paris where they wanted to meet with Minister Talleyrand, but he was secretly approached by 3 representatives from France before they could even meet. They demanded a loan of 32 million florins and a bribe of $250,000 just to talk with the minister. And we were like, we're not going to pay you $250,000, loan you 32 million florins. We're not. So they left. Now, when John Adams found out about this, he was really upset about it, and he didn't want to sensationalize it. So when they were publishing the article in the newspapers, they called them X, Y, and Z because we did not want them to be famous. Do you know the names of the 3 men that we refer to as XYZ? I don't, and I don't feel like learning it. Marshall, on reaching New York, was hailed as a hero for not giving in. Now, this is going to incite a lot of anger through the United States. Millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. So we are going to get ready for war, and they're going to be pushed at a feverish pace. Now, the Navy Department is going to be created, and the 3-ship Navy is expanded, as you can see them building them here. The Marine Corps is reestablished, and a new army of 10,000 men is authorized but not fully raised. And it's super sneaky. I think it's on the next slide. But it's super sneaky because Hamilton is going to convince Washington to put him in charge of the army. So Washington is going to go to John Adams and say, hey, maybe you should put Hamilton in charge. I mean, you're not going to tell your old president no. So the war itself was confined to sea, mostly the West Indies. 2.5 years of undeclared hostilities. American pirates and men of war are going to capture 80 vessels. Several hundred Yankee merchants are going to lose their ship. But we weren't at full war yet. And then this guy becomes an issue. Who is this? Napoleon. So France didn't want war. They were facing many European foes. Talleyrand saw little benefit, and let it be known that if Americans would send new minister, he would be received with proper respect. So Americans' envoys found things better when they reached Paris in 1800. Napoleon Bonaparte, pictured there, had recently seized dictatorial power. So he didn't have to deal with Talleyrand. At the convention of 1800, France agreed to annul their 22-year alliance, the Franco-American alliance. We agreed to pay damage claims of the French ships. Adams deserves immense credit for pushing for peace because he kept us out of war. We could not afford a war. And he smoothed the path for peaceful purchase. Imagine if we had gone to war with France, we never would have been able to buy Louisiana from him. He did good. Federalist actions to muffle Jeffersonians. So all of these Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans are going to criticize the Federalist government. So Adams and his Federalists are going to pass a series of laws because, hey, they're in charge of Congress. They could do what they want. The first act raised the residence requirements from 5 years to 14 years. So when you come to America, you can't apply to be a citizen for 14 years. And that was done specifically to prevent immigrants from voting because most of them would have voted for Jefferson. Under second law, president could deport dangerous foreigners in time of peace and imprison them in time of war. So this was never enforced, but this was pretty much like, I don't want to say freedom of speech because that's really the Sedition Act. This is more the Alien and Naturalization Act. The Sedition Act is going to slap at 2 freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment, speech and the press. Anybody who criticized the government or defamed the officials would be liable to heavy fine and imprisonment. Many Jeffersonians were indicted under it. and 10 were even brought to trial and convicted. And this totally violated freedom of speech and press. But when your political party controls the courts and all of the laws, then you can't fight it. Federalists are also going to take aim at pro-Jeffersonian. Oh, I already said that. Oh, okay, so I just redid it. The Sedition Act seemed to conflict with the Constitution. Federalists manipulated hysteria, and Jefferson feared possible slide to a one-party dictatorship. So Jefferson is going to secretly pen a series of resolutions approved by Kentucky legislature in 1798. Madison is going to do the same thing in Virginia, and they're both going to say basically that the nation was a creation of the states. States were the final judges if this had been broken. So they basically said that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional, and if the states wanted to ignore them or annul them because they were unconstitutional, they could. We didn't have judicial review yet, so this was the next best thing. And it was just resolutions, just planting the seed, the idea in the United States people. No other legislature fell into line. Federalist states added ringing condemnations, but they didn't follow suit. They argued the people had made the original compact. It was up to the Supreme Court to nullify this. But how? We don't have judicial review yet. Oh, goodness. Look at this. There's the dog. Do you see the dog? Okay, so the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were brilliant formulation of extreme states' rights views, later used to support nullification and secession. Neither Jefferson nor Madison had any intention of secession. It was just saying, hey, we don't like these laws, let's cancel them. And then further generations are going to say, hey, our founding fathers said we could secede. Sweet. No. Okay, so there's going to be an election of 1800. Differences between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans are going to be strongly divided. Conflicts over some domestic policies and foreign policies are going to undermine the unity we had during the Revolutionary era. I'm not going to go over how the different ones were. Just know that the Federalists wanted a strong government, loose interpretation. The Democrats wanted the opposite. The Republicans wanted states' rights. The Federalists wanted strong government. The Federalists wanted manufacturing in cities. The Republicans wanted farms and plantations. It was just complete opposites. And you can see it from this table. If you want, you could pause the video to look at it. And that's the end of the chapter. So I will see you all for chapter 7. Thanks for watching.